John Parker had spent most of his life in the military, a career defined by precision, discipline, and a deep respect for order. After decades of service, he had retired to a quiet, gated community on the edge of town, looking for a peaceful, quiet place to spend his golden years. His new property, a sprawling, tree-shaded lot at the end of a narrow, winding cul-de-sac, offered him the perfect combination of privacy and security, the kind of place where a man could finally relax, tend to his garden, and enjoy the quiet, unhurried pace of retirement. But old habits die hard, and John, ever the engineer, couldn't help but see his new home as a project, a blank canvas on which to apply his decades of experience in security systems and structural design. So, after a few weeks of careful planning and meticulous preparation, he installed a custom security gate at the entrance to his property, a heavy, reinforced structure complete with high-tech sensors, cameras, and a thick, steel locking mechanism that would make even the most determined trespasser think twice. The gate itself was a marvel of modern engineering, its thick, reinforced steel frame welded together with the same precision and attention to detail that had defined John's career as a military engineer. It was painted a deep, matte black, its smooth, polished surface absorbing the warm, late afternoon sunlight as it swung open and closed with a soft, mechanical hum, the quiet, rhythmic whir of its hydraulic hinges barely audible over the faint, rustling whisper of the wind through the tall, swaying branches of the oak trees that lined the edge of his property. For John, the gate represented more than just a practical barrier against unwanted visitors. It was a symbol of his independence, a tangible expression of his desire to live his life on his own terms, free from the constraints of the outside world. But not everyone saw it that way. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, took one look at John's new gate and saw only an eyesore, an unwelcome intrusion on her carefully curated, perfectly manicured world of white picket fences, neatly trimmed hedges, and perfectly aligned flower beds. To Karen, the gate was an affront, a direct challenge to her unspoken authority over the neighborhood, a blatant disregard for the carefully crafted image of suburban perfection she had spent years cultivating. It wasn't long before Karen made her displeasure known. She appeared on John's doorstep one bright, breezy Saturday morning, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she rapped sharply on the thick, polished wood of his front door, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, weathered surface as she waited impatiently for him to answer. John, who had been in the middle of installing a new set of solar-powered motion sensors along the edge of his front lawn, straightened slowly, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the sunlit grass as he wiped his large, calloused hands on a thin, worn rag and made his way to the front door, his thick, steel-toed boots clomping softly against the cool, polished marble tiles of his front hallway as he reached for the thick, brass doorknob and pulled the door open with a sharp, irritated flick of his wrist. Karen didn't waste any time on pleasantries. She crossed her arms over her chest, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a fierce, judgmental scowl as she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward the heavy, reinforced frame of John's gate, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in thinly veiled contempt as she spat out her carefully rehearsed list of grievances. "That gate," she snapped, her voice sharp, brittle, her tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of someone who had never been challenged, "is an eyesore. It doesn't fit the aesthetic of this neighborhood. It needs to come down." John felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he listened to her rant, his large, calloused hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides as he fought to keep his voice calm, his deep, dark eyes never leaving hers as he replied. "The gate is fully within my property line," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "It's compliant with all local regulations and HOA guidelines. I've double-checked the setbacks, the height, the materials, everything. You have no right to demand that I remove it." Karen's lips thinned, her thin, pale cheeks flushing a faint shade of pink as she straightened, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles of John's front porch as she took a small, hesitant step back, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she replied. "Well," she spat, her voice rising an octave as her frustration began to seep through the cracks in her polished, suburban facade, "I'll have the HOA take a look at it. I'm sure they'll agree that it's a violation of community standards, an eyesore, a nuisance, a safety hazard. And when they do, you'll have no choice but to take it down, or face hefty fines and legal action. With that, she turned on her heel, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles of John's front porch as she marched back down the narrow, gravel path that led to his front door, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she disappeared around the corner of his house, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of her phone as she dialed the number for the HOA office and began whispering her lies into the thin, polished speaker of her phone. John had hoped that Karen's initial outburst was just a momentary lapse in judgment, a brief, irrational flash of suburban entitlement that would quickly fade into the background noise of his otherwise peaceful retirement. But as the days passed, it became clear that Karen had no intention of backing down, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she whispered her venomous lies to the other members of the HOA, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. The first real sign that Karen had escalated her campaign came one bright, breezy Tuesday morning as John stepped out onto his front porch, his large, calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, his sharp, dark eyes narrowed in thinly veiled suspicion as he scanned the long, neatly trimmed rows of hydrangeas and sunflowers that lined the edge of his front lawn. He frowned, his thick, steel-toed boots clomping softly against the cool, polished marble tiles of his front porch as he reached for the thick, brass handle of his custom security gate, his large, calloused fingers tightening around the smooth, polished metal as he prepared to swing the heavy, reinforced frame open and make his way down the narrow, gravel path that led to his driveway. But as he tugged on the handle, the gate refused to budge, its thick, reinforced frame shuddering slightly beneath the force of his large, calloused hands as he pulled harder, his broad, muscular shoulders coiling like a spring as he braced his thick, steel-toed boots against the cool, polished surface of his front porch and gave the gate a sharp, frustrated yank. Frowning, John stepped back slowly, his broad, muscular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, sunlit grass of his front lawn as he peered through the narrow gap between the thick, steel bars of the gate, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he caught sight of the thick, reinforced padlock that had been clamped tightly around the heavy, polished metal latch of his gate, its thick, hardened steel frame gleaming softly in the bright, late-morning sunlight as it hung heavily from the thick, polished metal hasp, its thick, polished surface marred by the faint, jagged scratches of the thin, polished nails that had tightened it into place. A few feet away, bolted to the thick, reinforced steel frame of the gate itself, was a bright, red violation sign, its thick, polished metal surface glowing softly in the warm, late-morning sunlight as it declared his property to be non-compliant and subject to immediate fines. The thick, blocky letters of the neatly printed text casting long, sharp shadows across the cool, polished surface of the gate as they swayed gently in the warm, late-morning breeze. John felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he reached for the thick, reinforced frame of his gate, his large, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he tightened his grip on the cool, polished metal and gave it another sharp, frustrated yank, the thick, reinforced frame shuddering beneath the force of his broad, muscular shoulders as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that he had been locked inside his own property, his carefully constructed sanctuary transformed into a makeshift prison by the petty, vindictive woman who had declared war on his peace and quiet. Frustrated but not beaten, John took a deep, steadying breath, his broad, muscular chest rising and falling with the effort as he forced himself to remain calm, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the long, neatly trimmed rows of hydrangeas and sunflowers that lined the edge of his front lawn as he made his way slowly, deliberately back into his house, his thick, steel-toed boots clomping softly against the cool, polished marble tiles of his front hallway as he reached for the small, black remote control that controlled his security cameras, his large, calloused fingers moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems as he scrolled through the grainy, black and white footage on the small, flickering screen of his laptop. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. There, in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlit footage, was Karen, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she crept through the narrow gap in the hedges that lined the edge of his property, her long, polished nails glinting softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as she swung a small, black spray can in a wide, looping arc, the thin, neon paint splattering against the thick, polished steel frame of his gate as she scrawled a series of bright, jagged letters across the smooth, polished surface of the metal. She paused briefly, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a fierce, determined scowl as she reached into the small, black bag slung over her shoulder and pulled out a thick, reinforced padlock, its thick, polished metal frame gleaming softly in the faint, silvery glow of the moonlight as she hammered it into place, the thin, polished nails of her perfectly manicured fingers clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of the polished metal as she tightened the thick, reinforced frame of the lock around the heavy, polished metal hasp of his gate. John felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he watched the grainy, black and white footage play out before him, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had escalated her campaign of petty theft and intimidation to a whole new level, one that threatened not just his property, but his entire way of life. John Parker sat in his small, tidy home office, the cool, dimly lit space filled with the soft, steady hum of his computer's cooling fan and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the old, brass wall clock that hung above his neatly organized desk. His large, calloused hands moved with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems as he carefully sorted through the neatly labeled folders that lined the edge of his polished, wooden desk, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the thick, neatly typed pages of his security logs with the practiced, automatic precision of a seasoned engineer. He had spent the better part of the morning reviewing the grainy, black and white footage from his security cameras, his large, calloused fingers tapping rhythmically against the smooth, polished surface of his laptop as he replayed the same short sequence of video clips over and over again, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he watched Karen creep through the narrow gap in the hedges that lined the edge of his property, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she spray-painted his gate with bright, neon graffiti and hammered a second padlock into place. John felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his broad, square shoulders coiling like a spring as he watched the footage, his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had no intention of backing down, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her poison through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. Frustrated but not beaten, John took a deep, steadying breath, his broad, muscular chest rising and falling with the effort as he forced himself to remain calm, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the thick, neatly typed pages of his security logs as he reached for his phone, his large, calloused fingers moving with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to control as he dialed the number for the local police department. His pulse thundering in his ears as he listened to the faint, distant hum of the ringing line, the cool, artificial tone echoing through the quiet, empty air of his home office as he waited for someone to pick up. After a few long, tense moments, the line clicked, and a thin, high-pitched voice crackled through the small, black speaker of his phone, the faint, electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher answered the call. "City Police, what's your emergency?" the voice asked, the faint, tinny echo of the line crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher spoke, her tone calm, professional, her words carefully measured as she waited for John to reply. "Yes," John said, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of his home office like a blade, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I'd like to file a report. My property has been vandalized. I have video evidence of the perpetrator trespassing on my property, damaging my gate, and spray painting graffiti on my fence. I'd like an officer to come out and take a statement." There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line, the faint, electronic hiss of the connection crackling softly in the background as the dispatcher hesitated, her thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as she considered her response, her thin, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured plastic of her phone as she chose her words with the careful, deliberate precision of a woman trying to defuse a bomb. "All right, sir," she said finally, her voice low, hesitant, her tone carefully measured as she leaned back in her chair, her thin, angular frame creaking softly against the polished, black leather as she continued. "I'll send an officer out to take a look. Please remain on your property and wait for the officer to arrive. John hung up the phone slowly, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he set the small, black device down on the polished, wooden surface of his desk, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he listened to the faint, distant hum of the approaching police car, its low, throaty engine rumbling softly as it pulled up to the curb outside his house, the thick, black tires crunching softly against the loose, compacted gravel of his driveway as the officer climbed out and made his way slowly, deliberately up the narrow, gravel path that led to John's front door. But as the officer approached, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, uncomfortable scowl as he reached for the thick, brass handle of John's front door, John felt his heart sink with a cold, sinking certainty as he caught sight of the thin, polished badge pinned to the man's chest, its thick, polished surface glinting softly in the warm, late afternoon sunlight as the officer reached for his notebook and cleared his throat, his thin, polished lips twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as he spoke. "Mr. Parker," the officer said, his voice low, hesitant, his tone carefully measured as he flipped through the neatly typed pages of his notebook, his sharp, dark eyes flicking briefly toward the thick, reinforced frame of John's gate as he continued. "I've known Karen for years. She's a respected member of this community, a generous, upstanding neighbor, a dedicated volunteer. I find it hard to believe that she would do something like this. Are you sure you're not just overreacting? This sounds like petty neighbor drama, a personal dispute, not something the police should be involved in." John felt his fists clench at his sides, his pulse thundering in his ears as he listened to the officer's thin, polished voice crackle through the small, black speaker of his phone, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled anger as he realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that Karen had more allies in the community than he had thought, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she whispered her lies, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she spread her venomous gossip through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world. John Parker sat at his kitchen table, the dim, late afternoon sunlight filtering through the thin, sun-bleached curtains that framed his small, weathered window. His large, calloused hands moved with the calm, steady precision of a man accustomed to solving problems as he carefully sorted through the thick, neatly labeled folders that lined the edge of his polished, wooden desk, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the dense, neatly typed pages of his security logs with the practiced, automatic precision of a seasoned engineer. For weeks, he had endured Karen's petty, vindictive campaign of harassment and intimidation, his carefully constructed sanctuary transformed into a makeshift prison by the thick, reinforced padlocks and bright, neon graffiti that now marred the smooth, polished surface of his custom security gate. But John, ever the patient, methodical strategist, had not been idle, his sharp, analytical mind quietly churning through the countless possible solutions to his problem as he reviewed the grainy, black and white footage from his security cameras, his large, calloused fingers tapping rhythmically against the smooth, polished surface of his laptop as he watched Karen sneak through the narrow gap in the hedges that lined the edge of his property, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she vandalized his gate and hammered a second padlock into place. But John had a secret that Karen, in her blind, self-righteous arrogance, had never even considered. He wasn't just a retired engineer. He was a former military contractor, a seasoned expert in high-security installations for government facilities, his decades of experience in the field making him one of the most respected and influential figures in the industry. He had designed and installed some of the most sophisticated security systems in the world, his work protecting everything from high-ranking military officers to classified government installations, his carefully crafted, meticulously executed designs serving as the silent, unspoken guardians of some of the most sensitive, high-value targets on the planet. And his seemingly ordinary gate, the heavy, reinforced steel structure that Karen had so casually dismissed as an eyesore and a nuisance, was, in fact, a state-of-the-art security system, its thick, reinforced frame wired with cameras, microphones, and motion detectors that had been quietly collecting evidence of Karen's illegal activities for weeks. John smiled, his thin, carefully plucked eyebrows knitting together in a faint, satisfied grin as he reached for the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that lay on the polished, wooden surface of his desk, his large, calloused fingers tightening around the smooth, polished cover as he flipped it open and scanned the dense, neatly typed pages within, his sharp, dark eyes narrowing in thinly veiled satisfaction as he reviewed the long, meticulously detailed list of Karen's trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. Each carefully documented incident captured in crisp, high-resolution video and crystal-clear audio, the thin, polished microphones and high-tech sensors of his security system picking up every whispered threat, every sharp, bitter insult, every self-satisfied chuckle as she crept through the narrow gap in the hedges that lined the edge of his property, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of his gate as she scrawled her graffiti across the smooth, polished metal. It was all there, every petty, vindictive act, every whispered lie, every carefully calculated maneuver to undermine his authority, his peace of mind, his carefully constructed sense of security. And now, at last, it was time to strike. The following Thursday, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of his property crept slowly across the cool, polished marble tiles of the HOA meeting hall, John arrived dressed sharply, his tall, broad frame wrapped in a crisp, dark suit, the sharp, clean lines of the tailored fabric hugging his powerful, well-defined shoulders as he strode through the double doors and into the cool, brightly lit foyer of the building, his polished, black leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished, white marble tiles as he made his way slowly, deliberately toward the front of the room. The room fell silent as he entered, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd fading into a tense, strained stillness as the members of the HOA turned to stare at him, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously toward the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that John carried in his large, calloused hands, the thick, polished leather creaking softly against the smooth, polished surface of the podium as he set it down with a sharp, satisfying thump. John cleared his throat, his deep, dark voice cutting through the still, silent air of the room like a blade as he began to speak, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as his sharp, dark eyes scanned the assembled crowd, his broad, muscular frame radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low, steady, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he continued. "I have come here tonight to address the numerous, baseless accusations that have been leveled against me by your HOA president, Karen Miller." A faint, nervous murmur rippled through the crowd, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes darting nervously between John's tall, imposing frame and the sharp, angular features of their once loyal leader, her pale, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her sharp, polished heels clicking softly against the polished, white marble tiles as she crossed and uncrossed her long, slender legs. John calmly presented his evidence, including security footage, audio recordings, and legal notices, detailing Karen's trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. He hinted at a looming civil lawsuit for property damage, defamation, and emotional distress, his deep, dark voice ringing out through the still, silent air of the room, his tone calm, measured, each word carefully enunciated as he laid out his case, his large, calloused fingers flipping through the thick, leather-bound stack of documents with the practiced, automatic precision of a man accustomed to control, to power, to authority. As he finished, the room fell into a tense, strained silence, the faint, nervous whispers of the assembled crowd replaced by a quiet, stunned stillness as the members of the HOA, suddenly realizing their exposure, began to distance themselves from Karen, their once loyal ally, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights as they exchanged nervous, whispered glances, their eyes flicking nervously toward the sharp, angular features of their former leader, her carefully cultivated empire of suburban control crumbling beneath the relentless, crushing weight of the truth. A week after the explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood had settled into a tense, uneasy silence. The once friendly waves and nods of John's neighbors had faded into a strained, uncomfortable stillness, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights of the HOA meeting hall as they whispered nervously among themselves, their eyes darting nervously toward the thick, leather-bound stack of documents that John had presented, the neatly typed pages of his meticulously compiled evidence still fresh in their minds. Karen, for her part, had gone to ground, her sharp, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of her phone as she whispered her venomous lies to her rapidly dwindling circle of allies, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she tried, desperately, to regain control of the situation, her once unshakable authority crumbling beneath the relentless, crushing weight of the truth. But John, ever the patient, methodical strategist, had not finished with her. A week later, as Karen sat at her small, tidy kitchen table, the cool, early morning light filtering through the thin, sun-bleached curtains that framed her small, weathered window, she heard the sharp, insistent ring of her doorbell echo through the quiet, empty air of her home, the shrill, metallic chime cutting through her thoughts like the sudden, jarring crack of a gunshot. Frowning, Karen rose slowly from her chair, her thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, irritated scowl as she reached for the thick, brass handle of her front door, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the smooth, polished metal as she pulled the door open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her sharp, blue eyes narrowing in thinly veiled suspicion as she found herself face to face with a tall, thin man in a crisp, dark suit, his thin, angular face twisted into a tight, professional smile as he held out a thick, crisp, white envelope, its sharp, clean edges glowing softly in the bright, mid-morning sunlight. "Karen Miller?" the man asked, his voice smooth, polished, his tone dripping with the cold, calculated confidence of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. "Yes," Karen replied, her voice sharp, brittle, her tone laced with a faint, involuntary quaver as she took a small, hesitant step back, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she reached for the thick, white envelope, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured paper as she pulled it from the man's outstretched hand, her sharp, blue eyes flicking nervously between his thin, unreadable face and the neat, blocky letters of the high-profile law firm's logo stamped across the front of the envelope. Without another word, the man turned on his heel, his thin, polished shoes clicking sharply against the rough, uneven pavement of Karen's front porch as he strode quickly, purposefully down the narrow, gravel path that led to her driveway, his thin, angular frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the cool, sunlit grass of her front lawn as he climbed into a sleek, black sedan and sped off down the street, the low, throaty rumble of the engine echoing off the neatly trimmed hedges that lined the edge of her property as he disappeared around the corner. Karen closed the door slowly, her thin, trembling fingers tightening around the thick, crisp envelope as she made her way slowly, deliberately back into her kitchen, her sharp, polished heels clicking sharply against the cool, polished marble tiles as she sank back into her chair and tore the envelope open with a sharp, irritated flick of her wrist, her thin, carefully made-up face twisting into a tight, thin-lipped scowl as she unfolded the thick, heavy sheet of crisp, white paper contained. Within, her sharp, blue eyes scanned the densely typed text, her thin, perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly as she read and reread the letter, her heart sinking with a cold, sinking certainty as the full, horrifying implications of the message began to sink in. It was a restraining order, barring her from coming within 500 feet of John's property, the thick, neatly typed lines of the court order spelling out in cold, impersonal detail the long list of offenses that had led to its issuance: trespassing, vandalism, harassment, property damage, defamation, each carefully documented incident captured in crisp, high-resolution video and crystal-clear audio, the thin, polished microphones and high-tech sensors of John's security system picking up every whispered threat, every sharp, bitter insult, every self-satisfied chuckle as she crept through the narrow gap in the hedges that lined the edge of his property, her long, polished nails clicking softly against the rough, textured surface of his gate as she scrawled her graffiti across the smooth, polished metal. And as if that weren't enough, The footage had gone viral. The grainy, black and white images of Karen's thin, carefully made-up face twisted into a tight, self-satisfied grin as she vandalized John's property, spreading like wildfire through the tightly knit web of their shared, suburban world, her carefully cultivated reputation as a pillar of the community crumbling beneath the relentless, crushing weight of public humiliation and widespread, viral ridicule. Weeks later, Karen received a thick, certified letter from a local courthouse, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit from John, seeking damages for harassment, property damage, and emotional distress. The HOA, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, voted unanimously to remove Karen as president, stripping her of her power and leaving her once pristine reputation in ruins. Her neighbors, finally seeing her for the bully she is, shun her completely, their small, friendly waves and nods replaced by tight-lipped glares and averted eyes as they hurry past her house, their pale, drawn faces reflecting the harsh, overhead fluorescent lights of the HOA meeting hall as they whisper nervously among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously toward the long, twisted shadows of the tall, neatly trimmed hedges that line the edge of her crumbling, forgotten empire.